Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Welcome tonight to our Black Catholic lecture. As we continue to celebrate our 100th anniversary of Catholic chaplaincy, our speakers are focusing on the questions of faith that will lead us into the next 100 years, which in this case also includes recognizing our past. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce our speaker, Dr. Shannen Dee Williams, who is an associate professor of history at the University of Dayton. Dr. Williams is a historian of the African American experience with research and teaching, specializing in women's, religious, and Black freedom movement history. She earned a Master of Arts in African American Studies from the University of Wisconsin at Madison and a Ph.D. in history from Rutgers University. Dr. Williams has received a Scholar-in-Residence Fellowship at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in New York City, a Charlotte W. Newcomb Doctoral Fellowship in Religion and Ethics from the Woodrow Wilson National Foundation, and an Albert J. Beveridge Grant from the American Historical Association, and the John Tracy Ellis Dissertation Award from the American Catholic Historical Association. Dr. Williams recently published the book Subversive Habits, Black Catholic Nuns in the Long African American Freedom Struggle. Following the lecture, there will be time for students to ask questions, and books will be available to purchase in the back of the room. Please help me to welcome Dr. Williams as she addresses the topic, Confronting America's Real Sister Act, Black Catholic Nuns in United States History. You're welcome.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you all for joining us this evening in honor of the 32nd anniversary of Black Catholic History Month in the United States Church. Before I begin my formal remarks, I do want to begin by extending my deepest gratitude to the St. Thomas More Chapel staff for organizing tonight's event and for inviting me to come and to share some of my research. Indeed, I cannot think of a better group of church members to honor in this particular moment besides the nation's Black Catholic sisters, who were the first representatives of our church to teach and to champion Black and Black Catholic history within Catholic boundaries. My talk this evening draws from my recently published book, again entitled Subversive Habits, Black Catholic Nuns in the Long African American Freedom Struggle. And as you will notice, I did tweak my title a bit. Now it is America's Real Sister Act, The Hidden History of Black Catholic Nuns in the United States. Now, my book provides the first historical survey of Black Catholic nuns in the United States and restores Black sisters as pioneering religious educators, as pioneering desegregation foot soldiers, womanist theologians, and Black power advocates to their rightful place in the long history of the African American struggle for freedom, justice, and human dignity. My book, though, began really as an attempt to make sense of what I consider to be a rather extraordinary news story and photograph that I stumbled upon in early 2007. At the time, I was in graduate school at Rutgers and in desperate search of a paper topic for my seminar in African American history. I had taken to perusing microfilmed editions of Black-owned newspapers in search of what I knew would be a little-known dimension of the American past. And while scanning through a roll of the Pittsburgh Courier, I finally encountered a 1968 article announcing the formation of a Black Power Federation of Catholic Nuns called the National Black Sisters Conference. The article's title alone, Black Sisters Weigh Contradictions in Christian and Secular Community, immediately piqued my interest. However, it was the accompanying photograph of 4 smiling Black Catholic nuns that steadied my hand on the microfilm reader that day. Until that moment, I, a lifelong Catholic, had never seen a Black nun, except in a Hollywood film. In fact, the only sister that I knew at that time, Black sister that I knew at that time, was Sister Mary Clarence, the fictional character played by Whoopi Goldberg in the critically acclaimed Sister Act film franchise. Deeply ashamed of my ignorance, I soon learned that I was not alone. Even my mother, who had attended Catholic schools for the entirety of her formal education, and who in 1974 became one of the first 3 Black women to graduate from the University of Notre Dame, was unaware of the existence of Black nuns in our church. And my mother is on the left in pink. No, only white nuns taught us in our schools, my mother relayed to me on the telephone later that evening. But I wish I had known. I wish we'd had Black nuns in Savannah when I was growing up. Stunned by my mother's revelation, I set out to learn as much as I could about the National Black Sisters Conference and to understand the roots of the invisibility of Black Catholic sisters in our lives. From Father Cyprian Davis's landmark study of the U.S. Black Catholic community, I discovered among many things that there had been Black nuns in my mother's hometown in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Before anti-Black prejudice and violent threats pushed these consecrated women out, members of 2 all-Black sisterhoods had helped to lay the foundation for and ensure the survival of the city's Black Catholic educational system. Their heroic efforts made my mother's, and by extension my own, journey into Catholicism possible. Yet the white sisters and priests who taught my mother, and hundreds of other Black children in Savannah during America's civil rights and Black power years, never once alluded to Black sisters in their lessons. According to my mother, her white instructors did not teach any Black history or art either. And after calling and writing a host of Catholic institutions to track down some of the sisters and ex-sisters who established the National Black Sisters Conference, I finally began to understand why. The saga of America's Black women who've dared to be poor, chaste, and obedient is largely untold, wrote Sister Mary Shawn Copeland in 1975. It is an uneasy story, not only because it is rooted in the American dilemma, racism, but also because the position of a woman in an oppressed group is traditionally delicate and strategic. Now, by the time that I interviewed her, Dr. Copeland was a distinguished professor at Boston College and the first Black president of the Catholic Theological Society of America. She had also been out of religious life for 13 years. In the 1960s and 1970s, however, Dr. Copeland, who was the first African-American Felician sister in Detroit, Michigan, and later an Adrian Dominican nun, had been one of the conference's most visible leaders. She had also done more than anyone else to preserve the memory of the organization in the face of marginalization and erasure. In addition to publishing the first scholarly article on the National Black Sisters Conference, Dr. Copeland in the early 2000s arranged for the deposit of the organization's papers at Marquette University. I'm so glad you're interested in the Black Sisters Conference, Dr. Copeland expressed to me during our first conversation. We've been waiting on someone to tell this story. Now, while Dr. Copeland's willingness to share her experiences with me proved pivotal, it was Dr. Patricia Gray, the National Black Sisters Conference's founding president and one of the 4 nuns featured in that Pittsburgh Courier photograph, who radically changed my book's focus. Routinely described by her women and men peers as one of the most intellectually talented and charismatic Catholic sisters of her generation, Gray, who was known in religious life as Sister M. Martin de Porres, had been the conference's heart and soul in its formative years. As Pittsburgh's first Black religious sister of mercy and the conference's leading public voice, she was also the face and force of what people were calling the new Black nun in the 1960s and 1970s. However, in 1974, Gray abruptly departed religious life and stopped giving interviews related to the conference. "I don't like to look back," Dr. Gray frequently repeated during the first of our many conversations over the years. However, after I presented her with a recently published book on Catholic sisters' activism in the Black freedom struggle of the 1960s and 1970s, she quickly changed her mind. Visibly frustrated by the book's erasure of Black sisters' vanguard activism in the Catholic fight for racial justice, its cursory mention of white sisters' longstanding practices of white supremacy and exclusion, and its glaring omissions about the one Black nun briefly discussed in its pages, the 65-year-old ex-nun quietly stood and departed the room. Several minutes later, Dr. Gray returned with a treasure trove, her personal archive from her tenure in religious life. In handing over the materials, Dr. Gray revealed that in the 1970s, The conference's executive board had desired to publish a book documenting Black sisters' history in the United States. She also lamented to me the enduring visibility of Black sisters' lives and labors in church and wider American history. Then in her great wisdom, Dr. Gray gently encouraged me to consider expanding my attention to the mostly unsung and under-researched history of the nation's Black sisterhoods. We, the National Black Sisters Conference, were not the first Black sisters to revolt in the church, she quietly declared. If you can, try to tell all of our stories. So in my book, I recover the voices of a group of Black American church women whose lives, labors, and struggles have been systematically ignored, routinely dismissed as insignificant, and too often reduced to myth. For 13 years, I sought the untold stories of the nation's Black Catholic sisters, and I found no accounts bearing any resemblance to the fabled Hollywood tale of Sister Mary Clarence. I also failed to encounter Black sisters whose lived experiences confirmed many of the existing narratives of American Catholicism or the master story of Catholic sisters in the United States. Instead, from a host of widely ignored archival sources, previously sealed church records, out-of-print books, periodicals, and over 100 oral history interviews, I bore witness to a profoundly unfamiliar history that disrupts and revises much of what has been said and written about the U.S. Catholic Church and the place of Black people within it. Because it is impossible to narrate Black sisters' journey in the United States accurately and honestly without confronting the church's largely unacknowledged and unreconciled histories of colonialism, slavery, and segregation, I address these violent systems of power and exploitation and their perpetrators, male and female, directly. And in so doing, my book, Subversive Habits, recovers an overlooked chapter in the long African-American freedom struggle, a tradition of sustained Black Catholic resistance to white supremacy and exclusion that most scholars argue does not exist. When confronted with the silence past, the greatest responsibility of the historian and the most radical thing any person can do is to tell the story that was never meant to be told. So my book marks a new starting point in historical truth-telling in the Catholic Church and wider American society. For far too long, scholars of the American, Catholic, and Black past have unconsciously or consciously declared, by virtue of misrepresentation, marginalization, and outright erasure, that the history of Black Catholic nuns does not matter. In offering the first full survey of Black sisters' lives and struggles in the United States, my book unequivocally demonstrates that their history does matter and has always mattered. Of the over 2,500 Black women and girls who we know have entered religious life in the United States, the overwhelming majority of them entered the nation's historically 8 Black sisterhoods. All of these communities were founded in the South, and all but one were or were slated to be teaching communities. What's significant in the story of the nation's Black sisters, though, is that although we know that religious life becomes possible and is made possible as a result of the formation of historically Black sisterhoods, the reality is they are not the first Black women to seek admission into religious life. Beyond the anti-Black admissions policies of white congregations, perhaps the greatest testament to the ferocity with which we know white Catholics rejected Black religious vocations is the fact that historians cannot say with any certainty who the nation's first Black nun was. The realities of racial passing and archival erasure suggest that we may never know her name or the exact circumstances of her life. What is absolutely clear to us, though, is that the first African-descended women and girls known to profess vows in the United States in 1824 were not the first to seek entry into religious life. In 1819, for example, we know that a priest from New Orleans, Louisiana, writes the inaugural bishop of the Louisiana and 2 Floridas and offers a few girls of color desiring religious life to support the U.S. branch of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, which were established in the Missouri Territory in 1818. They were the first community of sisters to minister in Missouri. In response, the leader of that community, Sister Rose Philippine Duchesne, who is now a Catholic saint, wrote her superior in France proposing to admit these potential candidates from New Orleans to solve her order's problem or their inability to be able to locate suitable servants at Missouri's first Catholic convent and school. And although she suggested that these women be allowed to wear the order's regular habit, she requested that they be admitted at a third-class status below the converse sisters who performed manual labor and the choir sisters who taught in the schools. For his contribution, Bishop Louis Dubourg, who was a French native of the Caribbean slave colony of Saint-Domingue, which is now Haiti, and former president of Georgetown College, now Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., encouraged Duchenne to only consider candidates of mixed African and Native American descent, who he declared might otherwise be reduced to prostitution. The slaveholding Dubourg, who went on to found an academy that became St. Louis University in Missouri, also suggested that any candidates, Black candidates, be admitted to a subaltern profession with a different habit than converse sisters. He also reiterated to Duchenne soon thereafter inaugural U.S. Bishop John Carroll's defense of anti-Black disdain and segregation as, quote, a prejudice that had to be kept as the last safeguard of morals, unquote. For her part, Duchenne's superior in France, Sister Sophie Barras, who was also now a saint, granted the request, provided that it was not known that the girls of color were members of the society. Do not make the foolish mistake of mixing the whites with the blacks, she wrote. You will have no more pupils. The same for your novices. No one would join if you were to receive Black novices. We will see what we can do for them later. And although nothing seemingly came of these tacit approvals until 1948, when the order admitted its first Black candidate in New York City, we know that African-American requests to the Society of the Sacred Heart continued. This is a community that would come to own over 150 enslaved people. Indeed, we know one of the vocations that was lost was an enslaved woman who was owned by the community, who was in fact buried with the community, but was never allowed to join the community. The first successful community of Black sisters in the United States, but also in the modern world, are the Oblate Sisters of Providence, founded in Baltimore, Maryland in 1829. Their foundress, Mother Mary Lange, is one of 6 African Americans currently on the road to canonization in the Catholic Church. This community is born of the Haitian Revolution. Mother Lange herself flees with her mother to the United States at the outbreak of what became the Haitian Revolution, and eventually settles in Baltimore, where she and several friends founded a school, particularly for the children of Black refugees who were excluded from most of the city's Catholic schools and other schools. Now, that community is founded in 1829, but we also know that those sisters, the founding members, had felt called to religious life beforehand. They are successful because they find a French priest who is willing to sponsor the community. From his diary, we get a good sense of the kinds of challenges that the sisters faced from the very beginning. Father James Jobert writes in his diary, quote, that for more than 10 years they had wished to consecrate themselves to God for this good work, waiting patiently that in his own infinite goodness, he would show them a way of giving themselves to him. Now, he does not tell us who were the communities that rejected the founding members of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, but there are only 3 communities of sisters that precede them in the Diocese of Baltimore, which is the nation's oldest diocese. They are the Carmelite Sisters in Baltimore, the Visitation Sisters in Washington, D.C., and St. Elizabeth Seton's Sisters of Charity, which were all slaveholding communities. Father James Jobert also documents the profound resistance that the inaugural members of the community face. He wrote, quote, I knew already that many persons who had approved of the idea of a school for pupils disapproved very strongly that of forming a religious house and could not think of the idea of seeing these poor girls, colored girls, wearing the religious habit and constituting a religious community. He also documents that many of the nation's earliest priests also characterized the formation of the Oblate Sisters of Providence as a, quote, profanation of the habit, unquote. Nonetheless, the community will survive and thrive, establishing what is still the nation's oldest and continuously serving Black Catholic school in St. Francis Academy in Baltimore. What is significant also about the Oblate Sisters of Providence is that they are the first U.S. Catholic sisterhood to reject the racist and sexist notion that a woman born into slavery lacked the necessary virtue to enter religious life. Indeed, when we think about their peers who are all, for the most part, are all slaveholding, it's also always important to remember that the Oblate Sisters of Providence are ministering among the nation's earliest sisters. They are not a slaveholding community. They refuse to engage in that kind of exploitation. Also significant note is that note is that 8 of their earliest members who entered before the federal abolition of slavery in 1865 were born into slavery. And in one case, one woman was still enslaved and was able to gain her freedom before she was allowed to profess vows. Of these former sisters who were born into slavery but ended their lives as nuns, we do have the manumission records for all of those sisters. This sister in particular is one, Ellen Joseph West, who was born into slavery and gained quite a following in her day because at the turn of the 20th century, she was believed to be the oldest Catholic sister in the nation. So several newspapers, including the New York Times, ran stories on her. Many of the earliest members of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, too, like many of the nation's earliest Black sisters, could trace their lineage to the earliest days of the church, not only to the free and enslaved African-descended people who built the early church, but also even to some early European Catholic families. Indeed, one of the earliest Oblate Sisters of Providence, Sister Mary Aloysius Beecraft, born Anne Marie Beecraft in Washington, D.C., was the granddaughter of Charles Carroll of Carrollton, who was the only Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence and who was cousin to Bishop John Carroll, who again was the nation's inaugural bishop. The second successful community of African-American sisters is the Sisters of the Holy Family, founded in New Orleans, Louisiana in 1842. Their chief foundress is also on the road to canonization within the Catholic Church. She has reached the status of Venerable Henriette DeLille. We know significant amounts about her. We do believe that she was the great-great-granddaughter of Charles de Bruyere, or Claude de Bruyere, who was one of Louisiana's earliest and largest slaveholders. He was also the inaugural royal engineer, whose crews of enslaved and free Black men built many of the earliest roads, the first canals, and the first levees in New Orleans. His crews also built the old Ursuline convent, which housed the nation's first community of sisters to minister within the land territory that became the United States, that ironically Henriette DeLille would never be able to enter due to the fact of her African heritage and her unwillingness to pass for white. We also know that the founding members of the Sisters of the Holy Family were women who could trace their lineage not only to African-descended people, but also to many of the nation's earliest European Catholic families. Indeed, from their first historian, Sister Mary Bernard Deggs, she tells us that all of the sisters were of the very first families of the city, and only one sister, Sister Suzanne Navarre, was a stranger from Boston. As for the rest, they were all natives of this state, but their fathers were all foreigners, some French, Spanish, or German. They were descendants of the first settlers of Louisiana. We know that the sixth member of that community, Anne Fazenda, in fact, was a descendant of the Spanish Catholic Pintado family, and that particular family did the earliest surveys of Spanish Florida and Spanish Louisiana. It's also important to note that the Sisters of the Holy Family are actually the first community of sisters to be founded in the state of Louisiana. Now, there are a few other communities that precede them in ministering in the state of Louisiana, but all of them had mother houses in Europe, specifically in France. They were the first community established in Louisiana. Also, if you note, if I go back, this particular community was denied the opportunity to wear habits for the first 40 or 50 years of their existence. They could not wear veils or any religious clothing signifying their religious status, that they have to fight for that right to be able to do so. They also sort of noted in their history the kinds of opposition that they faced from their counterparts. Sister Mary Bernard Deggs tells us that, quote, "We had a very hard time, for we had many enemies who wanted to degrade our dear little community, as poor as we were. We were persecuted by the Sisters of St. Joseph in this city. They tried all they could do to make us take off our habits. That was after 45 or 50 years that we had worked and suffered to have a religious habit. No one would think we were anything if we were not dressed in the holy habit." And particularly from the historical record, what we know in this particular case is that the Sisters of St. Joseph, who arrived in the United States after the Sisters of the Holy Family, believed that once the sisters won the right to wear their habits and design their own habit, that the habit that they created was too close to that of their lay sisters, which was their lowest rank of sisters. And they wanted to ensure that the Sisters of the Holy Family would be recognized as the lowest rank of sisters in the city of New Orleans, in which they fought to make that happen. Nonetheless, they will survive and they will thrive, and they are also still with us. And their St. Mary's Academy is the nation's second oldest continuously serving Black Catholic school in the nation, and the oldest continuously serving secondary school in the state of Louisiana. The third community of sisters that is still with us, and they are the youngest of the African American teaching sisterhoods, are the Franciscan Handmaids of the Most Pure Heart of Mary that were founded in Savannah, Georgia in 1916. They are the only Catholic sisterhood that we have, or the first to be recognized and organized in explicit response to a Jim Crow law. In 1915, a Georgia state legislator introduced a bill that would have barred African American teachers from teaching white children and white teachers from teaching Black children. And had it passed, it would have effectively barred Black children from the Catholic educational system because there were no Black nuns ministering in Savannah at that time. In response, a white priest who was ministering in the African American community, Father Ignatius Listener, first reached out to the Black sisterhoods to see if they could send sisters in to ensure that Black African Americans would maintain access to Catholic education. When the Black orders had no sisters to send, he then went across the country in search of a pious Black laywoman in hopes of founding a community to be able to circumvent the law in Georgia. And he eventually makes his way to Washington, D.C., meets with a Marist priest who is teaching at the Catholic University of America, who informs him of an African-American ex-nun who had been a member of a community that had failed in Convent, Louisiana, and who was a former oblate novice who was working as a domestic for the Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur at their Trinity College, which is now Trinity Washington University in D.C. Now, according to his records, his diary, he noted that he explained the situation in Savannah, that Eliza Barbara Williams went back into her room, came out a few minutes later and offered him her life savings and promised that she would be there soon. And we know that within 6 months, she is in Savannah, and within a year, she has recruited several women into the community to ensure that African Americans would be able to maintain access to the Catholic educational system in Savannah. Now, they run into a lot of problems and eventually are forced to flee Savannah in response to threats and great hostilities, both within the church and also outside of the church. They eventually make their way to New Jersey, where they work as domestics for a community of priests, and then eventually move into the Archdiocese of New York, where they take over a Catholic nursery that was designated to become the first Black Catholic nursery in New York City, and then begin to lay the foundation for the expansion of Black administered Catholic education in the city of New York. Now, I do want to mention one other community, the Magdalens. So most Black women who have gone into religious life in the United States join apostolic communities. Apostolic communities are communities that have ministries to the public, such as teaching, nursing, social work, those kinds of things. If an African-American woman, an African-descended woman, sought to become a nun, sort of the standard definition of a nun, someone who has very limited access with the outside world, who seeks a contemplative vocation where their primary vocation is prayer. They had very few opportunities to do that prior to 1922 unless they could pass for white. In this particular case, in response to those African-descended women who felt called to contemplative vocations, in 1922, the Archdiocese of Baltimore works with the Good Shepherd Sisters, who had a contemplative branch called the Magdalens, and they organized an all-Black branch of their Magdalens. In the 1960s, the Magdalens integrate back into the Good Shepherd Sisters. But I do note that up until this year, I still said that the Magdalens were still in existence because one of the Magdalens was still alive, Nellie Hawkins. She died this summer. But there's very little information about them. These are the only two photographs that I know that exist of the Magdalens. and the Good Shepherd Sisters have not maintained records, but I was able to interview Sister Nellie, and she was helpful in helping me identify all of these women in their hometowns, so we were able to preserve that piece of the history. Now, the struggle to desegregate the nation's historically white sisterhoods is a long journey. We do have examples in the 19th century of communities accepting African-descended women, and in some cases, in fact, African-descended women serving as superiors and even foundresses of white communities. But it will not be until after World War II that we begin to see white communities drop their anti-Black admissions policies. Now, in most instances, these are women who are either racially ambiguous enough to pass for white or just something as non-Black. Because most communities would still take Native American women, they would take non-Black Latina women, and they would also take women of Asian descent. So a Black woman just simply needed to be able to pass as something else. Anti-Blackness is the bar. And even then, it's a very difficult sort of experience, especially if you are caught. To give you an example of what this could look like, in the case of the Sister Servants of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, the IHM sisters, who are one of the communities of distinguished sisters in the United States, of educators, they operate 3 Catholic colleges. They were in fact founded by 2 African-descended women who sought to pass for white. They in fact were members of the Oblate Sisters of Providence. In 1845, the Oblate's French founder, Father James Joubert, dies. And in response, the Archbishop of Baltimore attempts to suppress the community and tells the sisters that they should go back into the community and be maids. And so they're in a moment of crisis. They will survive the chaos when a Belgian priest steps in to be able to support the community. But in that moment of crisis, 3 members decide to leave, and they receive an invitation to found a community in Michigan, the first community of sisters to minister in Michigan. 2 of the sisters go in 1845, and it becomes very clear to them that they can only found a white community. And so they send word back to the 3rd member that she can't come because she's too dark, and she will expose them. So they found a community that begins to expand, recruit significant numbers of women into their ranks, and in fact, that they begin to expand outside of Michigan into Pennsylvania, first Western Pennsylvania, and then also into Eastern Pennsylvania. However, their chief foundress, Mother Teresa Maxis Duchemin, who was also a foundress of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, runs afoul of the bishops, who know her secret, but also believe that she's a little too headstrong, she's a little too independent, she doesn't listen. And so even in their correspondence, they refer to her in racially derogatory ways. For example, in 1859, one example of the bishops referring to her, "I tremble when I think of the impression which will be made when our good people discover that their daughters have been sent to be placed under a mulatto superior. I do not think we are yet ripe for such an anomaly." In a moment of trying to keep her community together, she decides to go into exile, and she stays with the Grey Nuns of Ottawa, Canada for almost 20 years before she's allowed to come back into the United States and pass and reside with her community in her old age. And then she passes away. And then the community rewrites their history, assigning their 3rd member as their foundress and attempting to erase their African-American roots. Indeed, they close off their archives. Any attempt for anyone trying to get in, specifically to learn about the early days of the community, would be met with sort of a barrier. One superior put it in 1928 that, quote, "We are convinced that silence is the fairest, wisest, and most agreeable way of committing oblivion to this subject." In fact, if I go back for a second, this is the only image that we have of Mother Teresa Maxis Duchemin. It's not an image that you will see on their website, any website of an IHM school or even the congregation. Instead, you'll see an image that is based on this photograph, but in fact is an etching. And it's in part because this image is taken while Mother Teresa Maxis Duchemin is in exile in Canada. She is not wearing the habit of the community that she founded. She's wearing the habit of the IHM sisters. And so the image itself documents her exile, and it's an image that tells a history if you're aware of exactly what happened with the community. Now, in the 1990s, the IHM sisters formally apologized for erasing their African-American roots. They adopt an anti-racist platform, and one of the first things that they do is that they open up their archives to document exactly what they had done as their own form of reparation. They also have a triennial sort of reunion with the Oblate Sisters of Providence. to acknowledge their African-American roots. We also know that the Sisters of Charity of New York had an African-American superior in the 19th century. She is described in their only written history as the most hidden of the Mothers General. We know a little bit about her. Margaret Whiteman was born in South Carolina, either to a free or enslaved Black mother and a British planter father. She leaves the South and joins the Sisters of Charity, and eventually assumes the position of treasurer, mistress of novices, and eventually becomes a superior of the community and serves from 1891 to 1894. What we know from the oral history of the community is that after her death, one of her successors went into the archive and destroyed everything related to her except her prayer book and her rosary. I gave a talk in 2016 to the annual meeting of the Leadership Conference of Women Religious, and members of the Sisters of Charity were there. Afterwards, they invited me to their mother house to explore more about that history. And among many things they told me is that, yes, that is true, but if you go into our archive, you'll find that that person did not destroy everything, and a photo survived, and this is her. For those African-descended women who could not pass for white, they were all forced to leave the United States to enter into European communities more accepting of their vocations. Among these women that we have documentation for is Frederica Law of Savannah, Georgia, who entered into the novitiate of the Missionary Franciscan Sisters of the Immaculate Conception in Rome in 1880. She becomes ill, and she actually passes away in Rome, but she was allowed to profess her vows on her deathbed. She took the name Sister Benedict of the Angels and is actually the first member of her community to die. Now, even though she was admitted into the community, she was admitted at a lower rank. She was only allowed to become a lay sister. This is Frances Johnson of Baltimore, who entered into the Franciscan Sisters of Mill Hill in London. We know that she goes in 1885. And although she was initially admitted on an equal rank, the sisters ultimately decided to sort of train her at a lower rank, that of a lay sister. She does return to Baltimore, and she labors in Baltimore until her death in 1894. That community will not accept another African-American woman until the 1960s. The rest of their applicants, they would all direct to the Oblate Sisters of Providence. This is Mother Matilda Beasley, who actually founds the first community of Black sisters in Savannah, Georgia. She is a woman born into slavery of both African and indigenous descent. We know that she actually leaves the United States to enter into what we believe to be a Flora Clare novitiate in York, England. Sometime in the 1880s, comes back and founds her own community. What's significant about her story, among many things, is that her community, and when it begins to struggle in Savannah, Georgia, in the 1890s, seeks the help of the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament, founded by St. Catherine Drexel, who is the patron saint of racial justice, who founded a community specifically to minister in the African American and Native American communities. That community founds, among many things, Xavier University in Louisiana, which is the nation's only Black Catholic institution of higher education. What's also significant about that community is that they barred admission to African American and Native American women until after World War II. They take one woman who is Native American in the 1890s, but they reduce her to a rank of a house sister, meaning that she is relegated to cooking and cleaning. We know that shortly after the community is founded, when Mother Matilda Beasley's community begins to falter in Savannah, Georgia, they are advised by their bishop to go meet with Catherine Drexel to see if she would allow them to integrate into the community, or at the very least provide novitiate training for her members. And it's during this time, in this meeting with Mother Matilda in Philadelphia, that the community takes a vote on whether or not they're going to take Native American and African American women. And what's significant in their annals is that they say that Mother Matilda is a very saintly colored woman, and they will not accept her. And so when they decide to not accept her, and they say so because simply members will not live with Black and Native American women on equal terms, that they're also going to bar admission to Native American women, even though they had just taken a Native American woman. So for Black women seeking to go into white communities, there are going to be so many barriers that most of these women will just not be able to overcome it. In some instances, we'll see exceptions made. For example, in the case of the Sisters of the Holy Family of Nazareth, which was a Polish community, and that their first U.S. provincial adopted at least 6 mixed-race girls who were born to white mothers in Catholic hospitals, and we know that at least 3 of those women enter into the community. They will not accept their next African-American members until the 1950s. But of those adopted daughters, we know that 3 entered. The first is sent out of the country to minister, and the other 2 minister in Chicago, in Brooklyn, and Philadelphia. We know the Maryknoll sisters in New York also have an early Black member who passes for white. What's significant specifically from the annals is that she sort of tells the community when she is seeking admission that she will not be cut off from her surviving Black family members. Communities would make exceptions for African-descended women who could pass for white if they agree to cut off all relationships with their Black family members. So if you have a Black family member, they can't visit you, you just basically lose that link. And what we know from the annals is that Elsie St. Clair Davis tells the community that she will not be cut off from her stepfather and her half-sister, who are described in the community's annals as Black. And they sort of make the notion that they are really proud of her, and they allow her to come in, but they do not accept another African-American woman until 1956. And even in that moment, what's significant is that up until a few years ago, they did not acknowledge Elsie St. Clair as their first African-American member, not until I did contact the community. Also significant, in some instances, Black women who pass for white get caught in communities and are removed. Such happened with Mildred Dobert, who is from Mobile, Alabama. We know a bit about her. She was educated by the Daughters of Charity in their nursing school in Mobile. And in their records, the sisters sort of note that she was not allowed to attend her graduation and receive her diploma in public because they were fearful that her Black grandmother would come. She, in the community, is protected in a certain way because her father is very elite. He has a cigar factory. But after the father dies, you can trace the family as they begin to migrate away from Mobile. Many of them go into the West and begin to pass. She goes north first to St. Louis and enters into a community of the Religious Sisters of Mercy. What we know is that someone from Mobile writes the Mercy Superior in Washington, D.C., who then writes her subordinate in St. Louis and tells her, you have a Creole in the community and she has to come out. She is removed from the community, but I found her in the census in a visitation community in Richmond, Virginia, where she successfully passed for white until her death in 1963. The community never knew her racial status. Her superior in St. Louis never informed her new superiors in Richmond of her racial background. In fact, when I contacted the monastery, they didn't know. They put me in contact with a family who was unaware of their history, but were very happy to know. And that is how I got the photograph of Mildred Dobert, who in religion was known as Sister Perone Marie. Now, you do see exceptional cases, but most African-American women who could pass for white, even if they had the opportunity to enter white communities, steadfastly refuse to do so. They will not be cut off from their Black family members, and so they go into the Black communities. And in most instances, most white communities would not take you even if you could pass for white. Such was the case for Innocis Chenoweth, who was born to a white mother and an African-American father, who was educated by the Sisters of the Blessed Virgin Mary, the BVM sisters in Rock Island, Illinois, who was rejected admission into the community of her educators in 1934, who was then encouraged to write to Mother Catherine Drexel, who also rejected her, but who then directed her to the Oblate Sisters of Providence, where she remained for the rest of her life. She died just a few years ago. And indeed, that is the story of many of the members of the nation's historically Black sisterhoods. They had actually been educated by white sisters, rejected admission into the communities of their educators, and if they were lucky, they got directed to the nation's historically Black sisterhoods. And so we will have stories of Black Catholic families, like their white and European counterparts, who send many of their children into religious life. These are the famous Burke sisters of Louisville, Kentucky, who can trace their lineage to the earliest days of the church in the Catholic sort of Holy Land of Kentucky. The Burkes send 5 of their daughters to religious life. One sister becomes sick, and so she comes back and remains in secular life. But the 4 Burke sisters remain in religious life until their death. They just died. The last Burke sister died just a few years ago. These are the Prices of Baltimore, Maryland, who sent 4 of their daughters into the Oblate Sisters of Providence and 1 son into the Josephite community, which is a community of priests that minister primarily in the African-American community. These are the Thomas sisters of Akron, Ohio, by way of Lebanon, Kentucky, The three oldest Thomas sisters go into the Franciscan Handmaids of Mary in New York. Their younger sister, Josephine, actually desegregated a white community in Cleveland, Ohio. The last Thomas sister just died a few years ago. They can trace their lineage also to the Catholic Holy Land, and in fact, they can trace their lineage to Mary Eliza Spalding Smith, who was a formerly enslaved woman owned by the Spalding family that will give the nation two of its earliest bishops, in Bishop John Lancaster Spalding and Bishop Martin Spalding, and also an early female congregational leader in Mother Catherine Spalding, who was the founders of the Sisters of Charity of Nazareth. This family will give the church significant numbers of sisters, a lot of cousins, a lot of brothers, siblings that go into religious life in various communities, pioneering priests and sisters. In the case of Mary Eliza Spalding Smith, in fact, her son, one of her sons, becomes one of the first 4 African-American SVD priests and the nation's earliest Black Trappist monk. It's not until after World War II that we begin to see communities begin to rethink the morality of their policies, first with contemplative communities. The nation's first racially inclusive monastery for women is established in Alabama after 2 African-American women are rejected admission into a white Dominican monastery in Catonsville, Maryland. Afterwards, 3 members of that all-white monastery leave the community specifically to found a racially inclusive community, which they do so in 1944. And in 1946, we see the first significant breakthrough with the apostolic communities, with the community of historically German nursing sisters in St. Louis that admit 5 African-American women into their community, 3 in the summer and 2 more in December of that year. And for the earliest generations of Black women who go into religious life, they are oftentimes faced with profound barriers, and in some cases, they are only admitted on a segregated basis. Such was the case for the Sisters of St. Mary, who then became the Franciscan Sisters of Mary. Their first African-American members were barred admission from their mother house. They could not enter the mother house, and then they could only enter through the back doors. They had to eat and live separately, and even were forced to profess their vows separately from their white counterparts, which happened to quite a number of pioneering Black sisters. In this particular case, we have a photo of their segregated profession ceremony. And if you'll notice here, you'll see the segregated profession ceremony. Oops, sorry, go back. And if you'll notice here, so you see these are the 5 postulants. But if you'll notice here, there are 2 Black nuns who are seated here. These are Oblate Sisters of Providence. They administered in St. Louis since the late 19th century and were called to St. Louis specifically to minister to the church's formerly enslaved community, who were largely abandoned by the church after the federal abolition of slavery. And what you'll note throughout, in most instances, Black women and girls who desegregate white communities had oftentimes been educated by Black nuns, but even still, members of the Oblate Sisters of Providence in particular always made a point to be present when a white community desegregated their ranks. One, they wanted to be there in a show of solidarity, but also to reach out to those girls if they were ever having problems. And in part because so many pioneering Black sisters in white communities will transfer to the Black orders because they encounter such hostility. And indeed, perhaps one of the greatest interventions, or what I consider to be one of the most important interventions of my book, is to actually look at that process of desegregation to give us a sense of exactly how communities came to admit African-American women, or the strategies that they developed to actually exclude Black women from their ranks, even as calls increased for them to do so. Just to give you one example, in Chicago, the Religious Sisters of Mercy, which is one of the communities that gave me a significant access to their records, allowed me to sort of see how they responded to increasing calls for Black sisters and increasing admissions requests from their students. From their General Council minutes from 1946, Mother Provincial of the Province of Chicago, Mother Genevieve Crane, reported that she is being faced with the problem of accepting colored girls as postulants. Mother understands that a priest is sending in an application for 2 colored girls to enter the novitiate. The problem was discussed by the General Council, but no action was taken. Mother asked the members of the General Council to give it serious thought and fervent prayer. And what's significant specifically about these documents, which most historians have not had access to, is that one, we have a clear documentation specifically of communities referring to Black women and girls as problems before they ever step foot in the convent. And two, we begin to see how they respond to increasing calls. You have large numbers of white priests who minister in African American communities beginning to sort of put pressure on communities. Here in the case of Father John F. O'Brien, who was the pastor of Harlem's Church of the Resurrection, wrote to every community in New York City in 1946, specifically advocating for the young women in his parish, asking a general sort of admissions inquiry, and then sort of posing a searing moral question. Is the order Catholic enough to accept colored vocations? I'm in a colored parish and I'm immediately concerned with this information. And what we see over and over again is communities actually saying, no, that we're not Catholic enough. In the case of the Religious Sisters of Mercy, they even write to the Vatican to sort of see how they can address this issue. And here the superior is writing, quote, enclosed is a copy of a letter that I received from one of our mothers provincial relative to the acceptance of colored girls to our institute. The problem is forced upon us because of the number of colored students we now teach in our schools. Even though the training of colored subjects would necessarily differ in some respects from the training of other subjects, the colored would no doubt resent a separate novitiate. It seems too at this time the sisters in general would not welcome colored subjects into our present novitiates. And again, what this tells us is not only did they consider these girls problems, but it also helps us to understand that just because communities are willing to teach African Americans should not mean that they have a commitment to racial justice or racial equality. That being said, what I want us to end with tonight is specifically the stories of those who are able to break the barrier and to also give you insight into a forgotten group of Black freedom fighters in the United States. When Black women began to desegregate white communities, they also began to desegregate their communities' institutions. And many of these women go on to create and break some of the nation's most difficult racial and gender barriers. To give you an example, this is Sister Dr. Frances Douglass, who I want to end with this evening. She is going to be among that first generation of African American women who are able to desegregate white communities after World War II. She is the first African American daughter of the Heart of Mary, but she goes on to break a host of other barriers. She's the first African American to earn a Ph.D. in psychology from Fordham University. She's also the first African American to serve as the chair at DePaul University. What's interesting about her story is that when she assumes to become the head of the Department of Psychology at DePaul University, it's the same year and the same month that Dr. John Hope Franklin, who was a pioneer African American historian, assumes the head of Brooklyn College's Department of History. If you read most books in African American history and the history of higher education, Dr. John Hope Franklin is always considered to be the first African American to become a chair at a historically white university. The reality is we do have another one who's there at the same time, and in fact, we know that she is the first African American to chair a department at a historically white university. She's also the first woman to chair a department, a woman of color to chair a department at Marquette University. So what my book ultimately seeks to do is to recover the history of Black sisters in the Black freedom struggle, specifically looking at the ways in which they not only fought against racism and sexism in their church, but also fought to make their church truly Catholic. I hope that I have given you just sort of a great introduction into my book. Otherwise, just thank you for your time, and I look forward to the conversation to follow. Thank you.
Dr. Williams, thank you so much for the very abbreviated history of Black Catholic women. I'm just thinking of all these stories that you've heard and the women that you've met over the last several years for doing your research. If you were to raise up a few causes for canonization, what would be those stories that you would raise up right now for the women?
Oh, goodness. I would certainly draw your attention to the third African-American woman who is third African-American sister who is under consideration for canonization, and that is Sister Thea Bowman. Sister Thea Bowman is a member of the pioneering generation of African-American women and girls who desegregate white congregations after World War II. She's originally from Yazoo City, Mississippi. She desegregates her community, the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration, in 1953 when she's just 15 years old. And like that early generation, she will encounter profound resistance to her presence. She will be subjected to racial insults. She will endure teasing about her hair and Southern mannerisms. She had to stop breaking out in song when she felt happy in the convent. And the community members, they have admitted, right, that they were attempting to, and this is their quote, transform her into a, quote, Southern Wisconsin white woman. Nonetheless, she will endure. And some of the resistance that she found is really, really unconscionable. And she knew that if she told her parents, who had warned her that she would face resistance, that they would come get her, so she endures in silence. But she will go on to become a founding member of the National Black Sisters Conference. She also earns her Ph.D. in English from the Catholic University of America, where she teaches their first course on African-American literature in 1972. Goes back to Wisconsin, where she had been a racial pioneer. She had desegregated her order's college, Viterbo, and then goes on to teach English there, and then serves as the first African-American chair of a department there. But eventually goes back, moves back home to Mississippi, where she becomes the director, basically, of what preceded their Office for Black Catholics, and developed a revolutionary ministry of what people called her Ministry of Love that combined African-American historical truth-telling, preaching, singing, dancing, as a way to champion and celebrate the intellectual and cultural gifts of the Black Catholic community. And what she was doing and the kinds of mentorship that she provided in her ongoing fight against racism and exclusion and sexism, which she's very clear about sort of rejecting, takes its toll. We celebrate she is already a saint in the minds of so many people, but so many of the sisters that I interviewed also wanted me to tell this other aspect of her story. And like so many pioneering Black sisters in white communities and pioneering Black priests and bishops, she dies young. She dies when she's 53 years old. She dies from sort of breast and bone cancer. And so many of her peers have said that the weight, the cost, even before we truly had an understanding of the emotional and health cost of racism, they believed that that is what took her and so many pioneering Black sisters away from religious life and really away from us soon. But certainly, if you are interested in learning more about the saints, again, of the 6 African Americans on the road to canonization, 3 are nuns, and they are absolutely important to us because it is impossible to tell their stories without confronting this history of anti-Blackness within women's religious life. But certainly beyond Mother Lange and Venerable Henriette DeLille, certainly know the story of Sister Thea Bowman. I would probably also raise up the woman who's on the cover of my book, Sister Mary Antona Ebo, who was featured. She was one of the original Sisters of St. Mary who desegregated her community but was subjected to segregation within it. She is a member of the first delegation of sisters to march in Selma. And she gives this wonderful speech before the press in which she says, "I'm here today because I'm a Negro, a Catholic, and a nun, and because I want to bear witness." Who was an activist within her own right, whose story, I think, can truly transform us. She was the first Black sister that I interviewed for my book when I was a very young graduate student. And at the time, I was on my way out of the church, and I never told anybody that I was thinking about leaving. And in my conversation with her, even as she was telling me her story, she was preaching to me in a way that was so powerful and transformative. And I never even told her that, but she kept me in the church. And she passed on a few years ago, but certainly those are 2 that I think everyone should know. But then I would also say you need to know everybody's story, right? Because they're so amazing when we begin to learn who these women were. Thank you for that question. Can I take any other questions? And I think that there's a microphone, if you would like to come up. Thank you so much.
I was just curious to what extent the greater civil rights movements of the 20s and 60s and so on tracked with whether there's a relationship, a tension between the outside world, so to speak, and the world that these women endured.
Thank you so much. It's a wonderful question. What I found in my own research is that when we look at Black sisters' struggles for racial equality and gender equality within church boundaries, we see that they not only intersect with the secular Black freedom movements, but oftentimes inspire it. So chapter 2 of my book specifically focuses on the very quiet struggle waged by the nation's Black sisterhoods to desegregate the nation's historically white Catholic colleges and universities. Long before the Brown decision, Black sisters, specifically as members of the historically Black orders, began to desegregate Catholic institutions. They are the first Black students at St. Louis University. They're there in 1927. We always thought it was 1944. They're there in the 1920s. They reintegrate the Catholic University of America in 1933. They are the first U.S.-born Black students at Villanova College and a host of other Catholic colleges and universities. And they have to begin to desegregate these institutions because after World War I, state laws began to change that required the higher education of private school teachers. Before that, private education was not regulated. And the Catholic Church itself had resisted regulation by the state. But after World War I, they actually they want to raise the standards of Catholic higher education, and it's also a part of their post-war patriotism campaign. And so this becomes a Herculean task for all sisterhoods, because most sisters, regardless of race, if they had a degree, they had a normal certificate, and a few had bachelor's degrees. And so all sisters have to get this accreditation. The challenge, of course, for the Black teaching sisterhoods is that Catholic colleges and universities will not take Black women if you're Catholic or otherwise. And so they have to reach out to the Vatican. They say, we're in trouble. If our schools close, what will become of Black children? And these are some of the only places where they are teaching. They are offering sort of a curriculum that emphasizes racial pride, but is also trying to raise up race leaders. And so we know that they're teaching Black history. They're writing about it. They're writing about it in their master's theses and their bachelor's theses. And so they reach out to the Vatican, and the Vatican sends in officials specifically to begin to identify progressive white priests and sisters who operate Catholic colleges and universities. And they say, you need to figure out what you need to do to get these sisters in. What's significant is there's a group of white priests. They are the board of the Catholic Board for Mission Work Among Colored People. That was the title of it. And they are really radical for their time. So in 1921, they send out a pamphlet asking all the white sisterhoods in the United States who operate colleges to found scholarships for the Black sisterhoods at each of their colleges. What's significant is that these men in 1921 are saying, we of the white race have done much to degrade Negro womanhood, as is incontestably proven by the presence of 5 million mulattoes in our midst. We owe these women some reparation. And it's profound because you have a very small group of white priests and bishops, but who are using the language of reparations, but also citing the sexual abuse of Black women and girls before and after slavery as a reason for why the church must make some reparation in the 1920s. And so it's a history that no one knows. The sisters know it. They have it documented in their archives, and yet no one else knows it. They are desegregation pioneers, and they continue to desegregate schools. But many of their students will go on to desegregate schools, and their students say, the sisters were preparing us for this in this work. So it intersects, but also you're thinking of sisters, many of them, they are the daughters of civil rights leaders. Many of them had marched. They had participated in civil rights organizations before they go into religious life. To give you one example, the first African-American sister of Charity of Nazareth in Kentucky, Sister Barbara Haley, who passed away a few years ago, had been arrested for leading her Black Catholic high school's delegation in the Birmingham youth marches in 1963. She's arrested that summer, and she desegregates the community that fall. And one of the first things that she does is that when she goes into the community, a former slaveholding community in a mother house that a slave built, had lay workers that were segregated. And she was like, I will not work in a segregated. She leads a one-woman campaign. She gets the community to integrate their lay staff. And a host of other things. So she's fighting a lot of racism in the community. And she will go on to become one of the founding members of the National Black Sisters Conference. So that's just one example of many. Also, the Black sisterhoods are marching. They are marching in local campaigns. There are barriers to doing that. But we also know that the Black sisterhoods in parishes are hosting civil rights organizations and meetings, right? When other entities in their community will not host civil rights leaders, they're doing that work. They are running voter registration campaigns in Mound Bayou, Mississippi. It's a history that's been documented. The sisters will tell you what they did. It's just something that has not been picked up by historians of the civil rights movement or by historians of the church. Thank you so much for that question. Yes.
Hi, thank you for that talk. It was very, very interesting and very informative. I kind of have two questions. So the first one is, as I'm watching and listening to what you're saying, it's very interesting to kind of see and hear that a lot of these women who maybe were able to make a way were mixed race or racially ambiguous. So I wondered if you could maybe talk more about that and how that had an effect, or what that really did for a lot of these achievements and a lot of what was happening. Obviously colorism is something that has allowed certain people, especially in that time, to develop in ways that darker skinned black women and racially unambiguous black women, they were able to do things that they weren't able to do. So I wondered if you could maybe talk more about that and how much you found that to be an issue in your research. And then the second question was about how much of this, what was going on at the time, was indicative of the wider society, and how much of that remains in the Catholic Church today. Are black women still, volunteering to go and be in the Catholic Church and to be nuns, or is this something that has experienced a waning, and maybe other denominations have seen a rise maybe in black female participation?
Oh, goodness. Thank you so much for those questions. They're so wonderful. The first one I'll get to as it relates to color. Color matters, certainly in the case, and I want to start specifically with the Sisters of the Holy Family, founded in New Orleans. They are founded first as a Creole community. They also have a restrictive admissions policy from the beginning. They only admit elite women of a mixed race background. They are also, we know that the two of the three foundresses were also slaveholders, like many Afro-Creole elites. In the case of the second foundress, we found records that she owned at least two people. It's not clear what happens to them and whether she still owns them when she goes into religious life. In the case of their foundress, Venerable Henriette DeLille, we know that the woman that we have records for, in her last wills and testament, it's very clear that she's trying to protect her. She's ensuring that this woman will be protected if she dies and will be emancipated. That does not excuse them from their slaveholding background. And it also serves as a direct contrast to the Oblate Sisters of Providence, who don't do this, right? We also know that when they get the first application for which we have records for from an ex-slave woman who was also darker skinned, the community splits. Henriette DeLille is dead by this time. But the third foundress, who is not slaveholding and who the record tells us, that first history says, who rejected social distinction and who, quote, above all things loved justice, is the superior who is like, this woman is coming in to stand with her. And the bishop, for whom this formerly enslaved woman cooks for, says, we recognize the community that will accept this black woman. It's a move that is rife with colorism and elitism, and it's a problem that remains in the community that I address. I confront it head on because it is a reality. Because as much as race mattered within the Catholic Church, so did color. And so what we will see is, particularly when black women begin to desegregate white communities, many white communities have a preference specifically for racially ambiguous women, women who they perceive will not exhibit any racial militancy. Whether or not that's true is another thing. Or those whose appearance will not immediately reveal their decision to desegregate. So color matters because ethnicity matters in a lot of white communities too, right? Polish sisters who go into Irish communities have a lot of problems, Italian women, like there's just so much there. And then when you bring race into it, what's very interesting is, as many black sisters that I interviewed also many white sisters, and many white sisters said, I was from a working class background, and I was the person who was excluded up until we got our first black member, and that's when I became accepted, right? Because the bar became blackness. That being said, we do have examples of both priests and sisters who are racially ambiguous, who pass for white and do so specifically to maintain a clear social and political distance from the African American community. The vast majority of racially ambiguous black women who go into religious life, though, seemingly refuse not to do so. To give you one example, one of the Oblate superiors, who is the one who is going to force open the doors of so many Catholic colleges and universities, she has a choice. Her brother is going to go pass for white, and he finds a community for her that will accept her on the condition, because he wants to leave, but he doesn't want to leave his sister behind. And so he wants her to pass with him, and he finds a community, he finds a priest who helps him find a community that will accept her. The only condition is that their mother can't come. And we have her clear voice. I would never do that to my mother. She says, they are my own people. And I think God wants me to give them the first choice, and I don't think that I would be blessed if I were to do otherwise. So we have African-descended women who are making that choice over and over again. If we go through the group photographs of the African-American sisterhoods, they are literally filled with Black women who could pass for white, who are racially ambiguous. And these are the decisions that ensure the survival of the Black sisterhoods. These are people who are committed, right, to the Black community. We focus on sort of the stories of the Healy siblings, right, but they are not representative of the African-American community, and I try to make that very clear in my book. As it relates to, in terms of the Catholic Church and what's happening now, barriers still exist. Black women are still being pushed out of communities. The difference, though, is like the larger community of sisters, the African-American population also goes down after Vatican II, really sort of after, in the late 60s. What has pushed the Black population back up in the United States is because many African sisters are coming into the United States now. They're joining both, and they're doing this in the West in general. They're revitalizing communities. They are also entering into the African-American sisterhoods. And in Chapter 7, I specifically talk about those African-American sisters that go into Africa. In particular, just to give you one example, in Nigeria, the first indigenous bishop of Nigeria in Benin City comes to the United States in the 1970s, specifically to find African-American sisters to form Black sisters in the United States, because white sisters in European sisterhoods had not formed African sisters in a way that celebrated their heritage. And so they go to the National Black Sisters Conference, and Sister Sylvia Thibodeau goes to Nigeria, and she forms their first indigenous community across ethnic barriers. So if you go to Nigeria, they are the only sisterhood that wears kente habits. They have rejected the European, and they are actually in the United States now, because as the African-American sisters in New Orleans die, they are taking over their ministry, so it's gonna survive. So I also go through that in the book too. So lots of great questions. I hope I answered them. Thank you so much.
That was amazing. Thank you so much. Appreciate that.
Thank you. Thank you, yes. Okay, sure.
Hi, I really enjoyed the talk. Thank you so much. And I was actually really interested in what you were saying about how these nuns were really important in pioneering like the civil rights movement. And I can think of like a few parts of the world, like outside of the US, where nuns actually had an important role in promoting social justice. So for example, like nuns in the Philippines like fought against fascism. Can I ask if, and I don't know exactly how knowledgeable you would be on this topic, but do you think maybe is there something integral to this religious life, something integral to being a nun that sort of steers them towards promoting like justice? If that makes sense.
It's a wonderful question. Thank you so much for asking it. It's something that I consider all the time, right? When I think about, when we look at sort of the differences between African-American nuns and African-American priests, African-American sisters are far more progressive than their male counterparts. It's a fact. Indeed, the National Black Sisters Conference forms because sisters are excluded from the Black Catholic Clergy Caucus. So King is assassinated and the priests organize, and Sister M. Martin de Porres Gray is at that meeting of the priests, and they literally don't let her in. Like, she has to fight to get in. It's a really, really painful history and a story of misogyny and sexism that is very much present, and clericalism that is a part of that story. I think we have to remember that sisters, unfortunately, are barred from formal power. Sisters have a lot of power, right? They outnumber priests in so many areas. And so they have a great influence, right? They are in the day-to-day lives of people. They see them, you know, the hardships, they see the joys, the hardships, and everything in between. But also, I think because they are not a part of the formal structure of the leadership of the church, that they are allowed to, and they can move in different kinds of ways that perhaps their male counterparts cannot, or perhaps choose not to. And I don't mean to offend anybody. But I think that that's a part of the story. But I think in part, or at least when I think about it in my own work, you know, the sisters are still very much in a precarious position, right? Because they can't push too hard. They are vulnerable not only as women and women religious, but they are Black women religious, right? These are women who, when they had to meet with the priest, you know, or the bishop during segregation, right, they can't even schedule an appointment with him. They have to enter the back doors, and they have to wait all day to see if he has time to meet with them. I mean, just the kinds of things when they go to the annual meetings of the National Catholic Educational Association, right? The white sisters will not talk to them. They have to eat in a separate room. They deal with kinds of humiliations and discriminations that are unimaginable. And so they're vulnerable. And they were like, of course, we also are aligned to this church. And so we are vulnerable because, and one sister says in her master's thesis from 1939, we would be foolhardy to advocate for any theory that would bring violence upon our heads or that of our children. We cannot allow our schools to die, right? And so they're moving and shaking, they're taking a long view, and I think that's what sisters do. But I think because they serve the community of God and the people of God on a day-to-day level in ways in which oftentimes their priests, their male counterparts do not, I think that they develop a certain kind of skill set that requires the kind of activism that we will see. That doesn't mean that all of sisters will do that. I think the one thing that I would also say too is just remember when we think about the radical social teachings of the church, right, if we are sort of striving for the common good tells us that we're supposed to be in the streets and advocating and fighting for the most vulnerable, right? I don't want to suggest that is somehow that is an anomalous, right, to sort of what it means to be Catholic, right, for those who are very much informed by Catholic social teaching and all of its tenets as well. So I don't know if that's a good answer to the question, but what I do think is that it is rooted in the fact that sisters are very much engaged in the day-to-day people, right? And maybe I'll end with the words of Sister Thea Bowman, right? She said, women can't preach in the Catholic Church, but I can preach in the streets. I can preach in the homes. And it's that kind of preaching, right, that really sort of makes the difference. And so maybe that's helpful.
No, yeah, definitely. Thank you. That was so insightful.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Dr. Williams, thank you again for bringing so much of the story forward and the parts of history that we don't always know. And thank you all for joining us tonight. I invite you to join us again on December 4th for our final lecture this semester, the Mary Field and Vincent D. Picabeau Lecture on Women's Contribution to Church and Society, where Dr. Nicole Flores will address the topic, Our Lady of Guadalupe and the Art of Solidarity. Again, we have books for sale in the back, and I invite students to come forward and continue the conversation. Thanks. Good evening.